Hello and welcome to Project L, a customized keyboard I finished recently and which I teased last week in a short video. Essentially, I swapped the existing switches in this keyboard for a stock of brand new tactile green Alps, also called Neon Green or Lime Alps, to differentiate them from the more well-known linear green Alps, which have a much duller shade of green for the slider than the rather vivid and bright green used for these tactile green Alps. The L in Project L stands for Lime, if you hadn't guessed, by the way. I picked this old Wang keyboard as a chassis for the project, partly because this keyboard had a bunch of faulty switches anyway, and it needed a restoration job to begin with. Of course, I could have done the smart thing and mounted them in a Dell 8101, which is a quite sturdy keyboard that comes with a modern layout and a PS2 connector. But I figured these Lime Alps switches, which are extremely rare and quite exotic, deserved something a bit more special to live in. After carefully desoldering all the old switches, doing a restoration job on the mounting plate, putting the new switches in and resoldering them, this is the result. The keyboard works perfectly. It's now nice and fresh on the inside, and I cleaned the keycaps in the case as well, but I left in these shortcut key holders at the top here that the board came with. They show hotkeys for WordPerfect and WordPerfect Plus, and there's also a third one that you can note your own hotkeys on. You can just pull them out like this, by the way. The holders slot into these little gutters on the keyboard casing, which is actually really elegant. But despite being yellowed to the point of having become brown, I left them in because they're original and it adds to the character and uniqueness of the board in my opinion. This board is a Wang 725-3771 UK model from 1992, and it originally had salmon Alps in it with yellow Alps for the lock lights. I got it as part of a big batch of Wangs at the recycling center, which included another one of these from 1989, which also had salmon Alps, but with green Alps for the lock light switches, and a 725 that has Keytronic foam and foil switches instead. You might see one of them down the line later. For all 5 of them combined, I paid £2 or £3 or something, so all in all, it's a really good deal, I think. The switches are new old stock that I managed to find from a part supplier using the internal Alps part number, SKCM There were several suppliers that listed these switches, but they quoted me quite stiff prices, as much as $6.50 per switch, which would have been catastrophically expensive. I managed to find what I think was the mother supplier of these switches though, and I got them for just $1 a piece, which is a really good deal. So I bought 150, enough to build this keyboard and have some spares, and the last 59 they stocked got bought recently by someone in California. It appears that all these switches are now sold out. Using this same trick, you can still order new old stocks of black and white Alps, by the way, but both of those are already quite abundant in keyboards on the market anyway. Of course, I also looked everywhere to see if I could get new old stock blue Alps, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be the case. These Lime Alps, though, are super rare. They've only ever been found in a single model of keyboard to my knowledge, the Xerox JD2 Docutech keyboard, which is a fairly high-spec printing and scanning machine from the 90s. One custom keyboard using these switches, the Doku Saver, with switches from such a Docutech keyboard, was reported in the past, but as far as I know, Project L is the first ever keyboard with brand new tactile green Alps switches. For such a rare switch, we know a surprising amount about them. The images we have from the 1994 Alps catalogue show us both the operating force, part name, and even a force curve, which you can see on the right. Compared to a more typical tactile Alps force curve, such as the one on the left, it's very different. The tactile bump is right at the top, and the curve is much more smooth and gradual than usual. The reason for this is probably the tactile leaf, which is a completely different shape than that of other tactile Alps switches, such as oranges. In fact, it looks a little bit like the setup of brown Alps switches, which have a contact leaf on a fake switch plate that serves as the tactile leaf. They feel somewhat similar too, and it's possible that these tactile green Alps were made to replace brown Alps, but as of now there's no direct evidence for that. The force curve quite resembles the force curve of a rubber dome switch like Topper, by the way, which I mentioned in my HHKB review as well, and the feeling of the switches is fairly similar. That said, this has a much more mechanical feeling than Topra switches offer. It's much like the magnetic valve switches I reviewed recently, in fact, which also had a mechanical Topra-like feeling. Because of the tactile bump right at the start, the switches feel fairly stiff, although that could also be related to the switches being brand new, of course. So if you're a light-handed typist, these will probably tire you out quite quickly. They feel pretty nice though if you can handle the 70 grams of force. The version in this keyboard is the bamboo version of the switch, which means it's the newer version with slits. But the batch of switches I got also included a bunch of the old pine version with slits, which is even rarer. And the feeling of those is quite different, by the way. They feel much more tactile than these bamboo switches, and although they still have that characteristic rounded feeling, they remind me more of salmon Alps than the bamboo green ones. They also make much more noise. You can hear the slider impact the shell much more clearly. Here you go, I'll give you a quick demo of that. Similarly, with the keycap on them, the bamboo switches are much bassier than the pine switches. Here, listen to this. Furthermore, the slider is a much darker shade of green, and it looks more transparent, something that also appears to be the case between orange and salmon Alps. The typing noise is fairly typical of tactile Alps. It's a nice and full but not particularly quiet noise. Still not bad to listen to at all, something of a theme for Alps switches. As for the keyboard, it's a pretty interesting duck itself, with some pretty funky features. Weighing in at 1.8 kilos, it's far from a lightweight, and it has excellent build quality, with a strong, thick plastic case and a metal mounting plate underneath. This is the mounting plate of the keyboard before I assemble it. It was originally very rusted and quite badly pitted, but someone from the uni was kind enough to sandblast it for me and then repaint it black. I think it looks really nice now. They even included a primer for the paint layer, which the original paint coat didn't include. Looks really nice. And the backside looks really good too. Look at that. Very nice. It's got a key clicker on it, a little bit like the Zenith I reviewed a few weeks ago, but its implementation is completely different in every way. See, the Zenith had a simple piezoelectric beeper which made a little beep whenever you press a key. And you can switch it off using a hotkey, Alt plus tilde. The Wang has an actual speaker at the bottom, so it makes more of a tick noise instead of a beep. And unlike the Zenith, it's got a volume control, so you can adjust the volume. But unlike the Zenith, it looks like it's not possible to turn it all the way off. I don't know, maybe it has a hotkey like the Zenith, but if there is, I don't know what it is. Also, the Zenith had a repeat function where the beeper would keep sounding if you kept a key depressed, like this, which is extremely annoying, so I shut the beeper off on the Zenith. But fortunately, the Wang doesn't have that, so I can just leave it on. I also turned the volume all the way up because why the fuck not? It has 2 feet on the side of the keyboard, and you can pull them out and set them to one of 3 positions, allowing some freedom of adjustment, always nice to have. Despite being more exposed on the side, the feet knobs don't feel like they're going to come off anytime soon. They seem very tough. It's got a long ribbon cable with a considerable length of coil in it, so it can stretch quite a bit, and it's detachable too via here. Normally these come with a phone jack on the end because these keyboards were used for Wang terminals. Those cables look like this one, but this one actually has a 5-pin DIN connector on the end, and it can be used very easily with a Saurus converter. Here is the back of the keyboard, which has 2 stickers, one showing the model number 725 and Wang's address in Massachusetts, and another one showing the actual part number 725 3771 UK, as well as a manufacture date in 1992. There's also a label I added myself. I typed it on my Remington and then had it laminated at the university to put my own little fingerprint on the keyboard, as it were. The layout is somewhat weird because it's from a terminal, but for the most part it's a very typical modern ISO layout. It uses a fat-ass enter, which is an ISO enter except even bigger because they made everything on this side half a unit longer. The nav cluster and numpad are slightly different from normal. Not the end of the world, but it takes a little getting used to at first. And finally, this help button here I keep pressing thinking it's escape. But overall, the layout is pretty normal and very valid even to this day. The keycaps are great. They're Alps made thick PBT caps, nice and white, and they have really nice, sharp dye sublimed legends. Double dye sub on the numpad and nav cluster even, with a fairly bright blue color, very nice indeed, which gives the right side of the keyboard a quite lively appearance. The lock keys have integrated LEDs which shine through a little window in the cap, but unlike the vast majority of integrated LEDs, which are red, and bank lock lights, which are almost always green, these are a kind of yellow-orange in color, which is pretty interesting, looks nice and funky. The home keys use deep dishes rather than homing bars, which was more common back in the day, but nowadays you barely ever see that. Anyway, overall, this is a really nice keyboard. The switches are essentially mechanical Topris switches. They're really cool guys. And the Wang itself is a well-built keyboard with great caps and some cool features, so what's not to like here? That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard with the clicker turned all the way up.